Alabama.
You want me to say changes? I was just going to close hers. Do you want me to say? I'll just put no. Okay. I'll close this one out too. I'm Ann Slattery, and I'm from the Regional Poison Center, and the name of my presentation is Chicken from Church. Cases. On a January morning about 8:10, 3 children arrive in our pediatric emergency department with a complaint of food poisoning by the father. All 3 children had nausea, vomiting, and a headache, and they'd been vomiting all during the night and the early morning. It was an 11-year-old male, a 10-year-old female, and a 9-year-old female. The history for the father was the church had sent chicken the previous night, and they had eaten it the previous night before arriving in the ED. The family had experienced the vomiting throughout the night. The father was a very poor historian. He was a single father with custody of all 3 children, and he also had complaints of nausea, vomiting, and a headache. He was such a poor historian and was acting with such altered mental status that the question was even raised, like, why did he have custody of these children? They actually called social services just to check because he was acting bizarre. They were triage green, which means non-acute illness in our ED, and it's the lowest acuity with a normal wait of a couple hours. When they got back to the ED, the physical exam revealed the 11-year-old male, unremarkable, no past medical history. The 10-year-old female, unremarkable, no past medical history. The 9-year-old female actually vomited once she got back, and she had no past medical history. Now, for the audience question, the initial diagnosis, would you choose A, Salmonella, B, Staphylococcus, C, E. coli, D, Bacillus cereus, or E, none of the above? Okay. Well, it looks like 56% of y'all chose none of the above, but we'll find out the answer as we go on. Now to the expert panel. What would you do at this point? What labs would you recommend? And what would your differential diagnosis be at this time?
I'd put them on oxygen. I'd get an ABG with co-oximetry.
No other answers.
Okay. Would you have any differential diagnosis?
Carbon monoxide.
And that'd be your only one?
They didn't have any diarrhea.
No.
For some of the, as far as for the food poisonings, for salmonella, I'd normally think most of the time they have a lot of diarrhea, especially in the first 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Chicken isn't as associated with the other ones you put up there in the time frame.
Mm-hmm.
For Campylobacter would be days. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you would want to do a lot more history initially, trying to get the timing, whether anybody else had been exposed. But I think the key point, what you said, was the altered mental status, the bizarre behavior, because that doesn't generally go with most of the food poisonings. So and the other point was this was a January morning, and so even though Birmingham is not usually considered the cold belt, people do use heaters, so I think carbon monoxide is a good first guess and what we should look at.
Well, for differential diagnosis, we came up with 3: food poisoning, a viral GI illness, or carbon monoxide. The case continues. Now, these labs didn't come back to 1400, so these labs are 6 hours later, actually about 5 hours later, because they were drawn about an hour before. The 11-year-old male had a carboxyhemoglobin of 5. The 10-year-old female had a carboxyhemoglobin of 9. The 9-year-old female had a carboxyhemoglobin of 9. And the adult male had a carboxyhemoglobin of 26. All 3 children received oxygen by non-rebreather mask. The repeat CO levels were negative, and they were discharged to a relative's home. Now we have the new case, the father. What do you do with the father? We're at a pediatric emergency room.
Had he not been receiving oxygen
No,
at the time? But how did they get a level on him then?
because of his behavior, they went ahead and they drew. Well, yes, he did get oxygen when the children were getting oxygen there, but they drew the level when they just did the whole family.
So does that mean you cannot continue to treat him in that hospital? He has to be transferred to another acute care hospital?
Yes.
Okay, so that's where he needs to go.
Okay.
Which is about 2 blocks away, if I remember correctly, from my days at the University of Alabama. So you would just call down to the 911, get the ambulance, take them to the other ED.
Okay. Treatment for adult male with a carboxyhemoglobin level of 26. This is audience participation. Would y'all choose room air, 100% O2, hyperbaric oxygen, or none of the above? Y'all wanna go? Okay. It looks like 62% chose 100% O2.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Was the carboxyhemoglobin levels done after receiving the oxygen, and for what duration of time period?
Unfortunately, I do not know the answer to that. I believe the levels were drawn and oxygen was started. When they came back, the ED physician, especially when the child vomited, coming back to the ED, back to the back, immediately thought of, carbon monoxide, so levels were drawn. So all of that happened very quickly once they got back.
Okay, so just mainly room air at that point in time.
They'd been at room air for basically 5 hours.
What would have been the time that they actually got to be seen? Because you said they were triage green, it could have been several hours.
What I'm estimating from the charts, they didn't get back to about 4 or 5 hours.
Okay, so half-life.
So that might explain that the children's levels were a lot lower by the time they were actually seen. And you can imagine how high father's level might have been at the time of presentation as well.
So what would y'all recommend then for the father, just 100% O2 or?
By the time Dad got to the other hospital, what was he like?
Still altered mental status.
I think it also depends on what facilities are around you. We have a hyperbaric chamber in our town. So in where we would be, we recommend hyperbaric oxygen. But that's just because we have one in town that's very willing to take them. So I think part of it depends on what's around you and how long travel time would be to get to the nearest chamber and all of those things, and the safety of transporting that patient.
We actually at that time did have hyperbaric oxygen about 15 minutes away.
From my understanding, and there may be some new data that I haven't seen recently, there's not a real strong evidence that it is of use in a case where you have not had some special factor like passing out or syncope or pregnancy or something. I think if I had it available and he was still altered, I might recommend it. In my circumstance, believe it or not, I don't have access to one. I have to send people 2 hours away by helicopter, and it's a big mess, and I would generally not recommend it in that circumstance because of the access issue, and by the time we've treated somebody with 100% oxygen and they've recovered.
I think I would agree. I would think, obviously, if his level wasn't drawn for 4 to 5 hours when he came into the emergency department with the children, he was significantly higher with the half-life on room air, about 240 minutes or so, you know. So, but here's my practical approach to this. I totally agree it's very controversial. There's some evidence that it may make things worse, some evidence it doesn't help. But I think if you've got the hyperbaric chamber 15 minutes from the hospital, if, say, he didn't go to that hospital, or even if it's in the same, even if you have access to one, I think to me, the practical approach is discuss it with the hyperbaricist and decide jointly says whether or not this patient would be the candidate for HBO. I think that's the best course of action. It may not help to get HBO, but it certainly would not be something I would want to have to explain why I didn't consider it, and why, when I was in a town that had it, I didn't talk to somebody about it. And that's what they did. So that would be my opinion.
Thank you. Well, he was transported to an adult facility that had HBO, and he was treated with the HBO, and he was dove, I guess that's the proper terminology, once. All the heat in the home was electric. There was no gas source. Alabama Gas actually came out, even though they didn't have gas, and did go to the home and actually test the home, and there was no source found. The church had actually sent raw chicken to the home the night before, and the father had proceeded to grill the chicken between 6 and 9:30. He couldn't really remember when he did it the previous evening. He had placed the grill next to the door so that he wouldn't have to go outside, and the smoke filled the house, and the family had slept in the home overnight. And we actually did not find this out to 3 days post, because we did do a follow-up at home, and that is when we found out the source, and what happened, how long they'd been exposed. So all of this was found out 72 hours post-exposure. Do y'all have any questions?
I got a question for Dr. Thompson. My question is, would you consider using isocapnic hyperventilation for carbon monoxide poisoning, since that is published by your center, that article?
I can tell you I didn't have anything to do with that publication. It wasn't my center per se. I know it's been published in Toronto. I would do like Dr. Bronstein would do in this particular case. I would consult the hyperbarist, who happens to be one of the consultant physicians to the hyperbaric chamber in Toronto, happens to be the main author of that study. And depending on whether he was on call that day, might have triggered that the initiation of that therapy instead. But it's totally dependent on who's on call that particular day and what their interpretation of the literature is.
Well, thank you very much.
And our last presenter is Scott Schaefer, and he's a pharmacist, and he's from the Oklahoma Poison Control Center.
Hello, everybody. This is also my first presentation at NACCT. And my comment is that it feels like I'm being interrogated by the FBI. I don't know if you can see it, but these bright lights shining down on me. Let's take a look, get this started. The title of my case